On a cold morning in late March of 1987, every farmer in Hardin County, Iowa, was watching Linnea Vandermeer burn her own field. Not a controlled burn, not a planned burn, not a burn that anyone had told her to do or taught her to do or even suggested she considered doing. A burn she had designed herself after 2 years of reading, after 1 year of arguing, after 1 season of planting what nobody planted, and after 1 long winter of watching the frost records going back 40 years and realizing something that everyone around her had missed. They watched from the road, from truck windows, from the edge of the county road where the gravel meets the ditch. Some of them had driven out specifically to see it. Some of them had heard about it at the co-op the day before and made a point of being somewhere nearby when it happened. And some of them just happened to be driving past and slowed down, because a field on fire is a field on fire, and in Hardin County, Iowa, a field on fire in March is not something you see every day. She had just finished her 2nd year at Iowa State, studying agronomy under a professor named Dr. Mai. Emil Kovaric, who had spent 30 years studying small grain production systems across the northern plains, and who had told her in the 2nd semester of her freshman year that the most dangerous thing in agriculture was not drought or blight or price collapse. It was the assumption that what had always worked would always keep working. She had written that down in her notebook. She had underlined it twice. The field she was burning was 40 acres on the southwest corner of her father's farm. Her father, Jarrett Vandermeer, had farmed the same 640 acres in Hardin County for 31 years. His father had farmed it the original sod. The Vandermeers had been in that county since 1902, and in all that time not one of them had ever burned a field in March. Not one of them had ever planted what Linnea was planning to plant, and not one of them had ever had to stand at the kitchen table and convince a man like Jared Vandermeer that 85 years of family practice might need to change. She did it anyway. Let me tell you about Hardin County in 1987, because you need to understand the world she was walking into before you can understand what she was walking out of. Hardin County grew corn. That was not a decision anyone made. It was not a policy or a plan or a choice that a committee had voted on. It was just what Hardin County did, the way a river runs downhill. Not because someone decided, but because the slope was there and the water had no reason to go anywhere else. The soil was deep and dark and rich with organic matter laid down by 10,000 years of prairie grass and glacial till, and it grew corn the way some places grow rock or sand or pine trees. It grew it without asking. The farmers planted in May and harvested in October and sold to the elevator in Iowa Falls and started again. That was the rhythm, that was the year. The Vandermeers had followed that rhythm for 3 generations. Garrett Vandermeer was not a man who wasted movement or words. He planted corn on 580 acres and soybeans on the remaining 60 in a simple rotation that his father. He kept his equipment clean and his records straight and his fences tight. He was not a man who complained about prices or weather or government programs. Not because those things didn't affect him, but because complaining was a form of wasted energy. And Jarrett Vandermeer did not waste energy. He was methodical and consistent and unquestioning in the way that a man who has inherited a working system and kept it working has no particular reason to question it. His daughter was different from the first day she could read. Let me tell you about Linnea Vandermeer, because she is the reason this story exists, and she is different from almost every character this channel has ever told you about. She was 22 years old in the spring of 1987, which made her young enough that most of the men at the Hardin County Co-op did not take her seriously, and old enough that she had stopped expecting them to. She was the second of Jarrett's 3 children, the only one who had gone to college, and the only one who had come back. Her older brother Claus had taken a job with a farm implement dealer in Ames. Her younger sister had married a man in Eldora. Linnea had gone to Iowa State in 1985 with a worn canvas backpack and a notebook she had bought at the drugstore in Iowa Falls. And she had come back in the summer of 1986 with 3 more notebooks, a head full of questions. She was not a talker, she was a watcher and a reader and a writer down of things. Her hands were not soft. She had grown up on that farm, and she knew how to drive a tractor and pull a calf and fix a broken PTO shaft in a cold field at dusk, and she had done all of those things. But she also knew things that her father did not know, and that most of the men in Hardin County did not know, because she had sat in Emil Kovrick's classroom for 2 years and read everything he put in front of her and then gone looking for more. What she had found was this: winter wheat. Not winter wheat as a novelty, not winter wheat as a hobby crop, or a cover crop, or a soil amendment. Winter wheat as a primary cash crop, planted in September, overwintered under the snow, harvested in July, and sold at a price per bushel that in certain years or in certain markets made the per acre from what Hardin County had been doing. Let me tell you about the science, because you need to understand what she understood before you can understand why what happened next was so completely avoidable. Winter wheat is planted in fall and germinates before the ground freezes. It goes dormant under the snow. In spring, it breaks dormancy and resumes growth weeks before a corn planting window opens. It is harvested in early July, leaving the field clear for a summer cover crop or a fall planting of something else entirely. The root system is deep. Winter wheat roots can reach 4 to 6 feet into the soil profile, pulling up moisture and nutrients from depths that corn never touches. In a dry spring, that depth is the difference between a crop that survives and a crop that does not. In a year with a late frost, winter wheat's growth stage in April is still low enough to the ground that a killing frost that would destroy emerged corn does almost nothing to a wheat field that is still in its tillering phase. Kovrick had shown her the data from Kansas, from Nebraska, from the winter wheat belt that stretched across the southern plains and crept northward into Iowa's neighboring states. He had shown her the yield trials from extension stations in Missouri and southern Iowa. He had shown her the price, history going back to 1965, and the per-acre revenue comparisons in years when corn prices dropped and wheat prices held. He had shown her what a diversified small grain system looked like on a 640-acre farm, and what it did to the farm's vulnerability to a single price crash or a single weather event. Not a vague idea, a proposal with specific numbers. 40 acres of winter wheat on the southwest corner of the farm, which was the lowest lying ground with the heaviest clay content and the worst drainage, the ground that consistently underperformed on corn because it stayed wet in May and baked hard in August. She had calculated the seed cost, the equipment modification cost, the expected yield range based on the extension data, the expected price range based on the 5-year Chicago Board of Trade average, and the expected per acre bad year. In every scenario, the 40 acres of winter wheat outperformed the same 40 acres of corn on that specific ground by between $12 and $41 per acre. She brought the proposal to the kitchen table in August of 1986. The kitchen went quiet. Her mother, Hank, stopped wiping the counter. Her father set down his coffee cup. He looked at the papers she had laid out, and he looked at the numbers, and he looked at the map she had drawn, showing which 40 acres she was talking about. And then he looked at her for a long time without saying anything. "That's the Kovarik work," he said finally. "Some of it," she said. "The rest is mine." He picked up the revenue comparison sheet and read it slowly, the way he read everything. Not fast, not impatient, but with the careful, deliberate attention of a man who understood that numbers meant something, and that getting them wrong cost money. He set it down. He picked up the yield trial data. He set that down too. "I need to think about it," he said. That was not a no from Jarrett Vandermeer. That was about as close to a yes as you were going to get on the first conversation. Her mother waited until Jarrett had gone out to the shop, and then she came and sat down across from Linnea at the table and looked at the papers. "He'll say yes," Hank said quietly. "He just needs to feel like he thought of it himself." Let me tell you about what happened at the Hardin County Co-op in September of 1986, because that is where the story gets complicated. The Hardin County Co-op sat on the edge of Iowa Falls, on a county road that smelled like diesel fuel and dried grain, and the particular combination of rubber and oil that hangs around any place where farm equipment gathers. It had a long counter where the seed and chemical orders were placed, a bulletin board with land for sale and equipment for sale, and a few business cards for custom cutters and drain tile contractors, and a row of metal folding chairs along one wall where men sat in the morning and drank coffee. The man who held court at that counter most mornings was Dale Crowley. Dale Crowley was the co-op's agronomist, which in Hardin County in 1986 meant that he was the person farmers called when something went wrong with their corn, and the person whose recommendations shaped what most of the county planted and how they planted it. He had been in that role for 19 years. He had a degree from Iowa State, same school as Linnea, 22 years earlier, and he had spent 2 decades watching crops grow and fail in Hardin County soil, and he knew, by habit, by the accumulated weight of years, he was not a cruel man, he was not a stupid man. He was a man who had been right about enough things for long enough that he had stopped seriously entertaining the possibility that he might be wrong about something important. Linnea came into the co-op on a Tuesday morning in early September to order her winter wheat seed. She had a list. She knew exactly what variety she wanted. Pioneer 2550, a soft red winter wheat with good winter hardiness ratings for northern Iowa, and she knew how many pounds per acre. Dale Crowley was at the counter. She told him what she wanted. She told him the variety and the quantity and the delivery date. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the man sitting in the folding chairs, a farmer named Buck Sievert who had been coming to that co-op for 30 years, and then he looked back at Linnea. "Winter wheat," he said. The silence lasted about 2 seconds. Then Dale Crowley started laughing. It was not a mean laugh exactly. It was the laugh of a man who has seen a lot of things tried in a lot of fields, and who has developed, over 19 years, a fairly confident sense of which things are worth trying and which things are not. It was the laugh of a man who believed he was saving someone from an expensive mistake. It was the laugh of a man who had already decided before she finished her sentence that he knew more than she did, and who expressed that certainty the way certain men do, not with argument but with amusement. "Young lady," he said, and he said it, the way that phrase is always said when it means something other than what it says. This is corn country. You know what happens to winter wheat in Hardin County in January? It goes dormant, she said. Same as it does in Nebraska and Kansas and southern Minnesota. Southern Minnesota, he said, and he said it like she had suggested planting tropical fruit. We're 3 hardiness zones away from the Kansas winter wheat belt, she said. The extension data from Ames shows viable winter wheat production in Hardin County going back to 1971. I've seen the yield trials, he said, and maybe he had, and maybe he hadn't. The issue isn't whether it grows. The issue is whether it makes sense. You've got the best corn ground in the state. I'm not putting it on the best ground, she said. I'm putting it on the 40 acres on the southwest corner that's been yielding 118 bushels per acre on corn for the last 5 years, while the rest of the farm is at 162. That ground stays wet in May, and it cracks in August, and it doesn't drain right, and it never will. Winter wheat doesn't care about May drainage. It's already up and growing. His smile was still there, but it had gotten smaller. Your father know about this? He said. He approved it, she said. He ordered the seed. He did it without enthusiasm and without apology, and as she was walking out the door, she heard Buck Sievert say something from the folding chairs that she didn't quite catch, and she heard Dale Crowley say, "Well, she'll learn," and she heard them both chuckle. She drove home on the county road with both hands on the wheel and the radio off, and she did not let herself feel what she felt, and then she sat in the truck for a while and let it pass through her, and then she got out and went to work. Her father had given her the 40 acres. He had said it at breakfast 2 days after the kitchen table conversation over eggs and toast, without preamble. Plant your 40 acres, he said. We'll see how it goes. He did not say he believed in it. He did not say she was right. But he gave her the ground, and in Hardin County, giving someone the ground is the most serious form of permission there is. She planted in the 3rd week of September, 1986. The wheat went in at 1.4 million seeds per acre, drilled at 3/4-inch depth with a borrowed grain drill that she had calibrated herself in the driveway. The ground was dry enough to work and warm enough to germinate, and within 10 days she had a field of thin green wheat seedlings, standing in rows across the 40 acres, and it looked like nothing that had ever grown on that corner of the Vandermeer farm. The neighbors noticed people driving on the county road slowed down. A few of them stopped and got out and stood at the edge of the field and looked at it. One of them called Garrett and asked if he'd had a planting error. He told them no. He did not explain further. By the time the ground froze in November, the wheat had reached the 4-leaf stage and gone into dormancy, looking healthy and thick in exactly the way the extension bulletin said it should look. Linnea had photographed it. She had written down the plant count per square foot and the leaf stage and the soil temperature at 2-inch depth. She had a notebook that was already half full. The winter of 1986 to 87 was cold and long, and it buried the field under 14 inches of snow by January, and the snow sat there until the 2nd week of March. And when it melted, the wheat was still there green. Dormant still, but alive with the particular resilience of a plant that had been bred over centuries to survive exactly this. That was when she decided to burn. Let me tell you about why she burned, because this is the part that most people who watched from the road did not understand and did not try to understand. Winter wheat, as it breaks dormancy in early spring, accumulates dead leaf material from the previous fall's growth. That dead material, the dry, papery, lower leaves that die back during dormancy, can harbor fungal disease, particularly blotch that overwinters in dead tissue and spreads upward into new growth as the plant resumes. Kovarik had shown her the research. A controlled burn of dormant winter wheat in early spring, before active growth resumes, when the crown of the plant is still below the soil surface and protected, removes that dead material, reduces fungal pressure, and releases a pulse of nutrients from the ash that feeds the plant as it breaks dormancy. It was practiced in parts of Kansas. It was documented in the extension literature. It was not in any way a new idea. It was, however, a new idea in Hardin County, Iowa. She burned on a morning in late March, when the wind was calm and the soil was moist, and the wheat crowns were still safely below ground. She had a backpack sprayer full of water on her back, and her father standing at the field edge with a wet burlap sack, and she lit the field at the windward edge, and walked it across in about 40 minutes, and the dead material burned off clean and smelling like char. With the wheat crowns intact an inch below the surface, the people watching from the road saw a girl burning a field. They did not see the notebook. They did not see the 2 years of research. They did not see the fungal pressure data or the nutrient release calculations, or the extension bulletin from Kansas State that she had read 4 times and annotated in the margins. They saw fire, and fire on a field in March looked like destruction, and destruction looked like failure, and failure looked like proof that Dale Crowley had been right. By the time she got back to the house, the phone had already rung twice. One of the callers was a neighbor named Wes Hartwell, who farmed the section to the north, and who was genuinely concerned. The other was someone relaying a message from Dale Crowley, who had apparently heard about the burn within the hour, and whose message was, according to the relay, that he hoped she hadn't just killed her crop. Jarrett Vandermeer answered both calls. He said the same thing to both. She knows what she's doing. He said it without inflection, without emphasis, without the particular warmth that would have indicated he was certain of it. But he said it, and that, for Jared Vandermeer, was something. The wheat came back in April. It broke dormancy in the second week right on schedule, and it came up clean and green and without the gray-brown spotting that septoria produces on unburned fields. Linnea walked the field every 3 days and wrote down what she saw. Plant height, tiller count, leaf color, presence or absence of disease. She was building a record not because anyone had asked her to, but because she understood that proof requires documentation, and documentation requires time, and she had both. Have you ever watched something grow that everyone around you had decided was already dead? Have you ever had the experience of knowing something was working while the people around you were still waiting for it to fail? That is a particular kind of patience, not passive patience. The kind where you sit and wait and hope, active patience. The kind where you keep walking the field and writing things down and letting the plant do what the plant was bred to do, and you trust the science because you understand it, and you do not need the people at the co-op to believe it yet, because the field will make the argument for you in July. That is where Linnea Vandermeer was in April and May of 1987. The corn planting across the rest of the farm began in early May. Garrett was in the cab of the planter 12 hours a day, working the ground the way he always worked it, methodical and steady. The 40 acres of wheat were already 18 inches tall by the time the corn went in on the rest of the farm. They were a different green from the corn, a blue-green, cooler, and denser. And they moved differently in the wind, in waves, the way small grains do, and they looked like something that belonged to a different county entirely. The late frost came on the 14th of May. Let me tell you about the 14th of May, 1987, because that is the day this story stopped being about one girl's 40 acres. It came out of Canada, the way the worst late frosts always do. A mass of Arctic air that dropped south faster than the forecasts had caught, and by the morning of the 14th, the temperature in Hardin County was 26 degrees Fahrenheit. The corn that had been planted in early May, the corn that was already emerged, already showing its first true leaves, already 3 to 4 inches, froze. Not all of it, not everywhere. The ground that had good air drainage and sat on higher land came through with damage, but not total loss. But the low-lying ground, the heavy clay ground, the ground that held cold air the way it held water, the plants that had emerged froze at the soil line, and the growing point, which in young corn is still below the surface, but just barely took enough cold to kill it in the worst spots. Farmers walked their fields on the morning of the 14th and the morning of the 15th, and they looked at the pale, water-soaked leaves lying flat, and they knew what they were looking at. Gerrit Vandermeer lost corn on 60 acres of his low-lying ground. Not the southwest corner. The southwest corner had wheat on it, and the wheat did not care about 24 degrees in May, because winter wheat, at its jointing stage, can tolerate temperatures down to jointy. It stood there on the 14th of May, looking exactly as it had looked on the 13th, blue-green and dense, and indifferent to the cold that had just killed 60 acres of corn 2 fields away. Gerrit Vandermeer walked the wheat field on the morning of the 15th. He walked it slowly, the way he walked everything, and he looked at it for a long time. Linnea walked beside him. She had learned, growing up with this man, that silence was not emptiness. It was the space where Gerrit Vandermeer did his thinking, and filling it was not helpful. He stopped at the center of the field and looked back toward the barn, and then out toward the county road, and then down at the wheat around his boots. "You were right," he said. He said it quietly. He said it the way a man says something he has been thinking for a while and has finally decided to say out loud, not as a concession, not as a defeat, as a statement of fact from a man who dealt in facts. "I know," she said. And she said it the same way. Not triumphant, not relieved, just factual. She had known since March. She had known since the burn. Table in August. But knowing and being told are different things, and being told by Gerrit Vandermeer on a cold May morning with dead corn 60 acres away was something she would remember for the rest of her life. They walked back to the house without talking. At the kitchen table over coffee, Gerrit Vandermeer unfolded the farm map and put his finger on the southwest corner, and then moved it to 2 other parcels, the North 80 and the creek bottom ground, and he said, "What would you do with these?" She had proposals for both of them already written in her notebook. She had had them written since February. She did not say that. She said, "Let me show you what I've been thinking." And she got the notebook. That was the morning Gerrit Vandermeer stopped being a man who had given his daughter 40 acres to try something, and started being a man who trusted his daughter to think about the farm. Let me tell you about the harvest in July of 1987, because the numbers are the argument, and the argument needs to be made clearly. The wheat came off the 40 acres on the 8th of July. Linnea had arranged a custom cutter, a man named Harold Briggs from 2 counties south, who ran a John Deere combine and had cut winter wheat before, and the harvest took most of a day. At the July price of $3.42 per bushel, That was $198.36 per acre in gross revenue. The same 40 acres had averaged $189 per acre in corn revenue over the previous 3 years. In 1987, with the frost damage factored in, the corn that had been replanted on the damaged ground in late May yielded 94 bushels per acre at harvest, generating $141 per acre. The 40 acres of wheat outperformed the comparable damaged corn ground by $57.36 per acre. On 40 acres, that was $2,294.4. That was the number that mattered, not the price, not the yield, the survival. The 40 acres of wheat had been planted on the worst ground on the farm, had been burned in March in front of half the county, had been dismissed by the co-op agronomist, had been watched with skepticism by every farmer on the road. And it had come through a late frost that killed corn across 60 acres of the same farm and hundreds of acres of neighboring farms, and it had yielded nearly 60 bushels to the acre and paid its bills. And then some. Linnea wrote all of it down. She wrote the yield and the price and the revenue and the comparison to the corn ground and the frost date and the low temperature and the wheat growth stage at the time of the frost and the survival mentorwin. The cold tolerance a new notebook that she had started specifically for the production. Wreckers. Dale Crowley heard about the harvest in Hardin County. You do not keep a harvest quiet. The custom cutter talked. The elevator talked. By the end of July, people who had watched the burn in March and shaken their heads were now driving past the stubble field, gold and short and smelling like grain, and doing arithmetic in their heads. Dale Crowley did not call. He did not come by. His name did not appear in the Vandermeer mailbox. But at the co-op, according to Wes Hartwell, who had been there when it happened, the subject of Linnea Vandermeer's wheat field came up one morning in August, and Dale Crowley had said, without his usual confidence, that he supposed the year had been unusual, and that he'd want to see it over time before he'd recommend it to anyone. That was not the laugh from September of 1986. That was a man whose certainty had gotten smaller. Linnea heard about it from Wes Hartwell, who told her with a particular satisfaction that suggested he had not forgotten the September conversation either. She thanked him and went home and wrote it in the notebook. The fall of 1987, she planted 120 acres of winter wheat, the Southwest 40 again, and the North 80 that Jared had put his finger on in May. She had spent the summer working out the rotation, what would follow the wheat on the Southwest 40 after the July harvest, how to manage the seed bed on the North 80, what cover crop to interseed after harvest to protect the soil through the fall. She had talked to Koverick twice on the phone and read 3 more bulletins and written everything down. The rotation was elegant in the way that good systems are elegant. It used the calendar efficiently. It spread the farm's risk across 2 different crops with different weather vagaries, and it put the winter wheat on the ground that consistently underperformed on corn, which meant it was not competing with the farm's best acres. The 1988 harvest was better than 1987, 62 bushels per acre on the Southwest 40, 58 on the North 80. Prices had softened slightly, $3.18 per bushel, but the revenue per acre still outperformed what those specific fields had been doing on corn. More importantly, 1988 was a drought year across much of the Midwest. The corn on the rest of the Vandermeer farm suffered, not catastrophically, but enough, Yields dropped 15% from the 5-year average, and the price didn't compensate. The winter wheat, with its deep root system pulling moisture from 4 feet down, while the corn was burning in the top 18 inches of a dry July, yielded within 8% of the previous year. The drought that hurt the corn barely touched the wheat. Jared Vandermeer looked at the 1988 numbers in October and said nothing for a while. Then he said, "What's your plan for the creek bottom ground?" She had that notebook page ready too. "Let me tell you about the fall of 1989, because that is when Dale Crowley came to the farm. He came on a Tuesday afternoon in October, after the corn harvest was done and the wheat was in the ground for the 3rd year. He drove up in his co-op truck, white, with the Hardin County Co-op logo on the door, and he parked in the driveway and got out and stood there for a moment, looking at the farm the way a man looks at something he has been thinking about for a while. Linnea was in the shop working on the drill. She heard the truck and came out wiping her hands on a rag. Dale Crowley was 61 years old, and he had been the co-op agronomist for 22 years, and he had a way of standing that suggested he was accustomed to being the most knowledgeable person in a given location. That way of standing was still there, but it was carrying less weight than it used to. "Linnea," he said. "Dale," she said. He looked at the field to the south, the southwest 40, now in its 3rd year of winter wheat, the new seedlings already up and green in the October light. He looked at it for a while. "I've got 3 farmers asking me about winter wheat," he said. "After the drought, after what happened to prices this year, they want to know if it makes sense." She looked at him. "You told me this was corn country," she said. "September of 1986. You said, 'Young lady, this is corn country.'" He did not look away. To his credit, he did not look away. "I did say that," he said. "You also said I'd learn," she said. "I did learn. I learned in Kovarek's classroom, and I learned in the extension bulletins, and I learned in 3 years of production records on 120 acres of this farm. You want to know what I learned?" He waited. "I learned that the lesson isn't that winter wheat is better than corn," she said. "The lesson is that any farm that grows only one thing needs only one disaster to fail. The frost in 87 and the drought in 88 didn't hit the whole farm the same way because the whole farm wasn't doing the same thing anymore. That's not a wheat argument. That's a risk argument. And you've been giving risk advice in this county for 22 years, and somewhere in those 22 years you stopped asking whether the risk was distributed or just assumed." Dale Crowley looked at the field again. His hands were in his jacket pockets. "What variety are you running?" he said. She told him. She told him the variety, and the seeding rate, and the planting date, and the fertility program, and the burn protocol, and the rotation structure, and the revenue comparison. He listened. He asked 3 questions, all of them good questions, the kind of questions a man asks when he is actually trying to understand something, rather than trying to find the flaw in it. When she was done, he nodded. "I'll need the extension citations," he said. "For the farmers asking, I'll write them up," she said. "Come back Thursday." He came back Thursday. She gave him 4 pages of citations, and a summary of her 3-year production records, organized by field and year, and compared against the county corn average. He read it in his truck in the driveway, and then came back to the door and said, "Can I make a copy of this?" "Take it," she said. "I have the originals." He drove away, and she watched the truck go down the county road, and she stood there for a moment in the October afternoon, with the wheat field green behind her and the smell of turned earth in the air. That winter, Dale Crowley recommended winter wheat to 11 farmers in Hardin County. He cited the extension literature. He cited the drought resilience data. He cited without attribution the production records from a farm in the county that had been running the system for 3 years. He did not mention Linnea Vandermeer by name. But the 11 farmers who asked where the idea had come from, he told them, and they drove out to the Vandermeer farm and talked to her. And she talked to them from the notebook with the same specificity she had brought to the kitchen table in August of 1986. By the spring of 1991, 23 farms in Hardin County. The Hardin County Extension Office published a management guide for winter wheat production in north-central Iowa. Linnea Vandermeer was listed as a contributor. Her production records were cited in 3 of the guide's tables. Let me tell you about the winter of 1992, because that is where Jared Vandermeer said the thing he had been building toward for 6 years. The Iowa State Extension Service held a small grains conference in Ames. Linnea was asked to present her rotation system and production data. She drove to Ames in a borrowed Chevy Suburban with 3 years of updated notebooks and a set of charts she had made by hand on graph paper, and she stood at the front of a room, with 64 farmers and extensions in it. Garrett Vandermeer was in the back row. He had not told her he was coming. She saw him when she was about 15 minutes into the presentation, sitting in a metal folding chair in his good flannel shirt, with his hands on his knees, watching her with the same careful, unreadable attention he brought to everything. She did not stop. She kept talking. From the notebook, from the numbers, from the 3 years of walking the field every 3 days, and writing down what she saw. When she finished, there were questions. Good questions. The kind that come from a room full of people who are genuinely interested in what you've done. She answered them all. When the last question was done and the room began to break up, she looked to the back row. Jarrett Vandermeer was standing. He had stood up when the room began to applaud at the end of the presentation, and he was still standing. He was not clapping. He was not a man who clapped, but he was standing, and in that room, at that moment, it was the same thing. She walked back to him through the crowd, and he looked at her for a moment, and then he said, "Your grandfather would have wanted to hear that. That was everything. From Jared Vandermeer, that was everything." Let me tell you about what happened after, because the story doesn't end in that conference room in Ames in January of 1992. Linnea Vandermeer farmed the Vandermeer place for the next 30 years. She took over the full operation when Jarrett retired in 1997, and she expanded the winter wheat rotation to cover 280 acres of the farm's 640, rotating it against corn and soybeans in a 3-year system that she had refined over a decade of production records. The farm's revenue variance. The year-to-year swing in income. That is the thing that kills farms. Not bad years, but the unpredictability of bad years, dropped by 31% over the first decade of the full rotation compared to the decade beard. She had the numbers, she always had the numbers. The 40 acres on the southwest corner that she had burned in March of 1987 became, over time, the most productive ground on the farm on a per-acre revenue basis. The deep-rooted wheat had improved the soil structure over years of continuous cropping, breaking up the clay pan that had limited corn yields for decades. By 2001, that 40 acres was yielding corn at 148 bushels per acre in its corn years, 30 bushels better than it had ever done before she started the rotation. Dale Crowley retired from the co-op in 1998. At his retirement party, which Linnea attended because she was not a person who carried grievances past their useful life, he made a speech in which he said that the best thing he had done in his last decade at the co-op was listen to people who knew things he didn't. He did not say her name. He didn't need to. The people in that room knew who he meant. She kept the notebook from 1986. The original one, the one she had started at Iowa State and brought home in the summer, and filled with Kovarek's data and her own calculations, and the proposal she had laid on the kitchen table in August. It was on the shelf above her desk in the farm office, next to the notebooks from 1987, 1988, 1989, and every year after. She did not display it. It was just there on the shelf, the way tools are kept where they can be found when they are needed. In the spring of 2009, her daughter Maris, who was 19 and had just finished her first year at Iowa State studying soil science, came home for planting season and sat down at the kitchen table, the same chairs, the same window looking out toward the southwest corner, and laid out a proposal. Cover crops, not as a novelty, not as a hobby. As a full system integration, cereal rye and hairy vetch interseeded into the corn at V5 stage, terminated in spring before the wheat planter in suppressing weeds and reducing the farm's fertilizer cost by an amount that Maris had calculated from 3 amount that Maris had calculated her. Farm cert fertilizer created Nenbro use. One on-farm trial from a farm in Ringgold County that had been running the system for 4 years. The numbers were on the table. The citations were on the table. The production records from Ringgold County were on the table. Linnea Vandermeer looked at the papers. She looked at the map her daughter had drawn. She looked at the revenue comparison and the nitrogen credit calculation and the soil organic matter projection over 5 years. She set it down. Yes, she said. Not, I need to think about it. Not, we'll see. Yes, immediate and without qualification. The way you say yes when you recognize something you already believe in, when you see your own argument being made by someone who came to it the same way you did, by reading, by thinking, by refusing to accept that the way things have always been done is the same as the way things should be done. Maris looked at her. That's it, Maris said. Just yes. Your numbers are right, Linnea said. Your citations are solid. Your comparison farm is comparable. What else do you need from me? I thought you'd want more time. I had 30 years, Linnea said. You don't need my time. You need the ground. She gave her the ground, all of it, every acre, not 40 acres, to try something. All 640 acres to try the next thing, because that is what you do when you have spent 30 years learning that the person the room is least likely to listen to sometimes sees the answer before anyone else does. And when you have learned it not from a book but from a field that you burned in March while half the county watched from the road and waited for you to fail, Linnea Vandermeer still farms in Hardin County. The notebooks are still on the shelf, 43 of them now, one for every year since 1986. The Southwest 40 is still in rotation, still producing, still the ground that everyone wrote off in 1986, and nobody writes off anymore. The burn scar for March of 1987 is long gone, turned under by 37 years of tillage and growth and the slow, patient work of soil that has been treated well. The 1986 notebook is still there, first shelf, left side. The cover is worn and the spine is cracked and the pages are stiff with age, But the numbers inside are still right. They were always right. She burned a field in March. They laughed. The frost came. The corn died.